Chapter 11. The Persuasion of Fashion, Feeling Guards O''E.R. Its own. Carrie was an apt student of fortune's ways of fortune's superficialities. Seeing a thing, she would immediately set to inquiring how she would look, properly related to it. Be it known that this is not fine feeling, it is not wisdom. The greatest minds are not so afflicted, and, on the contrary, the lowest order of mind is not so disturbed. Fine clothes to her were a vast persuasion, they spoke tenderly and jesuitically for themselves. When she came within earshot of their pleading, desire in her bent a willing ear. The voice of the so-called inanimate. Who shall translate for us the language of the stones? My dear, said the lace collar she secured from partridges, I fit you beautifully, don't give me up. Ah, such little feet, said the leather of the soft new shoes, how effectively I cover them. What a pity they should ever want my aid. Once these things were in her hand, on her person, she might dream of giving them up. The method by which they came might intrude itself so forcibly that she would ache to be rid of the thought of it, but she would not give them up. Put on the old clothes, that torn pair of shoes, was called to her by her conscience in vain. She could possibly have conquered the fear of hunger and gone back. The thought of hard work and a narrow round of suffering would, under the last pressure of conscience, have yielded, but spoil her appearance? Be old-clothed and poor-appearing? Never. Druitt heightened her opinion on this and allied subjects in such a manner as to weaken her power of resisting their influence. It is so easy to do this when the thing opined is in the line of what we desire. In his hearty way, he insisted upon her good looks. He looked at her admiringly, and she took it at its full value. Under the circumstances, she did not need to carry herself as pretty women do. She picked that knowledge up fast enough for herself. Druitt had a habit, characteristic of his kind, of looking after stylishly dressed or pretty women on the street and remarking upon them. He had just enough of the feminine love of dress to be a good judge not of intellect, but of clothes. He saw how they set their little feet, how they carried their chins, with what grace and sinuosity they swung their bodies. A dainty, self-conscious swaying of the hips by a woman was to him as alluring as the glint of rare wine to a toper. He would turn and follow the disappearing vision with his eyes. He would thrill as a child with the unhindered passion that was in him. He loved the thing that women love in themselves, grace. At this, their own shrine, he knelt with them, an ardent devotee. Did you see that woman who went by just now? He said to Carrie on the first day they took a walk together. Fine stepper, wasn't she? Carrie looked, and observed the grace commended. Yes, she is, she returned, cheerfully, a little suggestion of possible defect in herself awakening in her mind. If that was so fine, she must look at it more closely. Instinctively, she felt a desire to imitate it. Surely she could do that too. When one of her mind sees many things emphasized and re-emphasized and admired, she gathers the logic of it and applies accordingly. Druitt was not shrewd enough to see that this was not tactful. He could not see that it would be better to make her feel that she was competing with herself, not others better than herself. He would not have done it with an older, wiser woman, but in Carrie he saw only the novice. Less clever than she, he was naturally unable to comprehend her sensibility. He went on educating and wounding her, a thing rather foolish in one whose admiration for his pupil and victim was apt to grow. Carrie took the instructions affably. She saw what Druitt liked, in a vague way she saw where he was weak. It lessens a woman's opinion of a man when she learns that his admiration is so pointedly and generously distributed. She sees but one object of supreme compliment in this world, and that is herself. If a man is to succeed with many women, he must be all in all to each. In her own apartments Carrie saw things which were lessons in the same school. In the same house with her lived an official of one of the theaters, Mr. Frank A. Hale, manager of the Standard, and his wife, a pleasing-looking brunette of 35. They were people of a sort very common in America today, who live respectably from hand to mouth. Hale received a salary of $45 a week. His wife, quite attractive, affected the feeling of youth, and objected to that sort of home life which means the care of a house and the raising of a family. Like Druitt and Carrie, they also occupied 3 rooms on the floor above. Not long after she arrived, Mrs. Hale established social relations with her, and together they went about. For a long time this was her only companionship, and the gossip of the manager's wife formed the medium through which she saw the world. Such trivialities, such praises of wealth, such conventional expression of morals as sifted through this passive creature's mind, fell upon Carrie and for the while confused her. On the other hand, her own feelings were a corrective influence. The constant drag to something better was not to be denied. By those things which address the heart was she steadily recalled. In the apartments across the hall were a young girl and her mother. They were from Evansville, Indiana, the wife and daughter of a railroad treasurer. The daughter was here to study music, the mother to keep her company. Carrie did not make their acquaintance, but she saw the daughter coming in and going out. A few times she had seen her at the piano in the parlor, and not infrequently had heard her play. This young woman was particularly dressy for her station, and wore a jeweled ring or 2 which flashed upon her white fingers as she played. Now Carrie was affected by music. Her nervous composition responded to certain strains, much as certain strings of a harp vibrate when a corresponding key of a piano is struck. She was delicately molded in sentiment, and answered with vague ruminations to certain wistful chords. They awoke longings for those things which she did not have. They caused her to cling closer to things she possessed. One short song the young lady played in a most soulful and tender mood. Carrie heard it through the open door from the parlor below. It was at that hour between afternoon and night when, for the idle, the wanderer, things are apt to take on a wistful aspect. The mind wanders forth on far journeys and returns with sheaves of withered and departed joys. Carrie sat at her window looking out. Druitt had been away since 10 in the morning. She had amused herself with a walk, a book by Bertha M. Clay which Druitt had left there, though she did not wholly enjoy the latter, and by changing her dress for the evening. Now she sat looking out across the park as wistful and depressed as the nature which craves variety and life can be under such circumstances. As she contemplated her new state, the strain from the parlor below stole upward. With it her thoughts became colored and enmeshed. She reverted to the things which were best and saddest within the small limit of her experience. She became for the moment a repentant. While she was in this mood Druitt came in, bringing with him an entirely different atmosphere. It was dusk and Carrie had neglected to light the lamp. The fire in the grate, too, had burnt low. "Where are you, Cad?" he said, using a pet name he had given her. "Here," she answered. There was something delicate and lonely in her voice, but he could not hear it. He had not the poetry in him that would seek a woman out under such circumstances and console her for the tragedy of life. Instead, he struck a match and lighted the gas. "Hello," he exclaimed, "you've been crying." Her eyes were still wet with a few vague tears. "Pshaw," he said, "you don't want to do that." He took her hand, feeling in his good-natured egotism that it was probably lack of his presence which had made her lonely. "Come on, now," he went on, "it's all right. Let's waltz a little to that music." He could not have introduced a more incongruous proposition. It made clear to Carrie that he could not sympathize with her. She could not have framed thoughts which would have expressed his defect or made clear the difference between them, but she felt it. It was his first great mistake. What Druitt said about a girl's grace, as she tripped out evenings accompanied by her mother, caused Carrie to perceive the nature and value of those little modish ways which women adopt when they would presume to be something. She looked in the mirror and pursed up her lips, accompanying it with a little toss of the head, as she had seen the railroad treasurer's daughter do. She caught up her skirts with an easy swing, for had not Druitt remarked that in her and several others, and Carrie was naturally imitative. She began to get the hang of those little things which the pretty woman who has vanity invariably adopts. In short, her knowledge of grace doubled, and with it her appearance changed. She became a girl of considerable taste. Druitt noticed this. He saw the new bow in her hair and the new way of arranging her locks which she affected one morning. "You look fine that way, Cat," he said. "Do I?" she replied, sweetly. It made her try for other effects that self-same day. She used her feet less heavily, a thing that was brought about by her attempting to imitate the treasurer's daughter's graceful carriage. How much influence the presence of that young woman in the same house had upon her it would be difficult to say. But, because of all these things, when Hurstwood called he had found a young woman who was much more than the Carrie to whom Druitt had first spoken. The primary defects of dress and manner had passed. She was pretty, graceful, rich in the timidity born of uncertainty, and with a something childlike in her large eyes which captured the fancy of this starched and conventional poser among men. It was the ancient attraction of the fresh for the stale. If there was a touch of appreciation left in him for the bloom and unsophistication which is the charm of youth, it rekindled now. He looked into her pretty face and felt the subtle waves of young life radiating therefrom. In that large clear eye he could see nothing that his blasé nature could understand as guile. The little vanity, if he could have perceived it there, would have touched him as a pleasant thing. "I wonder," he said, as he rode away in his cab, "how Druitt came to win her." He gave her credit for feelings superior to Druitt at the first glance. The cab plopped along between the far receding lines of gas lamps on either hand. He folded his gloved hands and saw only the lighted chamber and Carrie's face. He was pondering over the delight of youthful beauty. "I'll have a bouquet for her," he thought. "Druitt won't mind." He never for a moment concealed the fact of her attraction for himself. He troubled himself not at all about Druitt's priority. He was merely floating those gossamer threads of thought which, like the spiders, he hoped would lay hold somewhere. He did not know, he could not guess, what the result would be. A few weeks later Druitt, in his peregrinations, encountered one of his well-dressed lady acquaintances in Chicago on his return from a short trip to Omaha. He had intended to hurry out to Ogden Place and surprise Carrie, but now he fell into an interesting conversation and soon modified his original intention. "Let's go to dinner," he said, little recking any chance meeting which might trouble his way. "Certainly," said his companion. They visited one of the better restaurants for a social chat. It was 5 in the afternoon when they met. It was 7:30 before the last bone was picked. Druitt was just finishing a little incident he was relating, and his face was expanding into a smile, when Hurstwood's eye caught his own. The latter had come in with several friends, and, seeing Druitt and some woman, not Carrie, drew his own conclusion. "Ah, the rascal," he thought, and then, with a touch of righteous sympathy, "that's pretty hard on the little girl." Druitt jumped from one easy thought to another as he caught Hurstwood's eye. He felt but very little misgiving, until he saw that Hurstwood was cautiously pretending not to see. Then some of the latter's impression forced itself upon him. He thought of Carrie and their last meeting. By George, he would have to explain this to Hurstwood. Such a chance half-hour with an old friend must not have anything more attached to it than it really warranted. For the first time he was troubled. Here was a moral complication of which he could not possibly get the ends. Hurstwood would laugh at him for being a fickle boy. He would laugh with Hurstwood. Carrie would never hear, his present companion at table would never know, and yet he could not help feeling that he was getting the worst of it. There was some faint stigma attached, and he was not guilty. He broke up the dinner by becoming dull, and saw his companion on her car. Then he went home. "He hasn't talked to me about any of these later flames," thought Hurstwood to himself. I think he cares for the girl out there. He ought not to think I'm knocking around, since I have just introduced him out there," thought Druitt. "I saw you," Hurstwood said, genially, the next time Druitt drifted into his polished resort, from which he could not stay away. He raised his forefinger indicatively, as parents do to children. "An old acquaintance of mine that I ran into just as I was coming up from the station," explained Druitt. "She used to be quite a beauty." "Still attracts a little, eh?" returned the other, affecting to jest. "Oh, no," said Druitt, "just couldn't escape her this time." "How long are you here?" asked Hurstwood. "Only a few days. You must bring the girl down and take dinner with me," he said. "I'm afraid you keep her cooped up out there. I'll get a box for Joe Jefferson." "Not me," answered the drummer. "Sure, I'll come." This pleased Hurstwood immensely. He gave Druitt no credit for any feelings toward Carrie whatever. He envied him, and now, as he looked at the well-dressed, jolly salesman, whom he so much liked, the gleam of the rival glowed in his eye. He began to size up Druitt from the standpoints of wit and fascination. He began to look to see where he was weak. There was no disputing that, whatever he might think of him as a good fellow, he felt a certain amount of contempt for him as a lover. He could hoodwink him all right. Why, if he would just let Carrie see one such little incident as that of Thursday, it would settle the matter. He ran on in thought, almost exulting, the while he laughed and chatted, and Druitt felt nothing. He had no power of analyzing the glance and the atmosphere of a man like Hurstwood. He stood and smiled and accepted the invitation while his friend examined him with the eye of a hawk. The object of this peculiarly involved comedy was not thinking of either. She was busy adjusting her thoughts and feelings to newer conditions, and was not in danger of suffering disturbing pangs from either quarter. One evening Druitt found her dressing herself before the glass. "Cad," said he, catching her, "I believe you're getting vain." "Nothing of the kind," she returned, smiling. "Well, you're mighty pretty," he went on, slipping his arm around her. "Put on that navy blue dress of yours and I'll take you to the show." "Oh, I've promised Mrs. Hale to go with her to the exposition tonight," she returned, apologetically. "You did, eh?" he said, studying the situation abstractedly. "I wouldn't care to go to that myself." "Well, I don't know," answered Carrie, puzzling, but not offering to break her promise in his favor. Just then a knock came at their door and the maid-servant handed a letter in. "He says there's an answer expected," she explained. "It's from Hurstwood," said Druitt, noting the superscription as he tore it open. "You are to come down and see Joe Jefferson with me tonight," it ran in part. "It's my turn, as we agreed the other day. All other bets are off." "Well, what do you say to this?" asked Druitt, innocently, while Carrie's mind bubbled with favorable replies. "You had better decide, Charlie," she said, reservedly. "I guess we had better go, if you can break that engagement upstairs," said Druitt. "Oh, I can," returned Carrie without thinking. Druitt selected writing paper while Carrie went to change her dress. She hardly explained to herself why this latest invitation appealed to her most. "Shall I wear my hair as I did yesterday?" she asked, as she came out with several articles of apparel pending. "Sure," he returned, pleasantly. She was relieved to see that he felt nothing. She did not credit her willingness to go to any fascination Hurstwood held for her. It seemed that the combination of Hurstwood, Druitt, and herself was more agreeable than anything else that had been suggested. She arrayed herself most carefully and they started off, extending excuses upstairs. "I say," said Hurstwood, as they came up the theater lobby, "we are exceedingly charming this evening." Carrie fluttered under his approving glance. "Now, then," he said, leading the way up the foyer into the theater. If ever there was dressiness it was here. It was the personification of the old term spick and span. "Did you ever see Jefferson?" he questioned, as he leaned toward Carrie in the box. "I never did," she returned. "He's delightful, delightful," he went on, giving the commonplace rendition of approval which such men know. He sent Druitt after a program, and then discoursed to Carrie concerning Jefferson as he had heard of him. The former was pleased beyond expression, and was really hypnotized by the environment, the trappings of the box, the elegance of her companion. Several times their eyes accidentally met, and then there poured into hers such a flood of feeling as she had never before experienced. She could not for the moment explain it, for in the next glance or the next move of the hand there was seeming indifference, mingled only with the kindest attention. Druitt shared in the conversation, but he was almost dull in comparison. Hurstwood entertained them both, and now it was driven into Carrie's mind that here was the superior man. She instinctively felt that he was stronger and higher, and yet withal so simple. By the end of the third act she was sure that Druitt was only a kindly soul, but otherwise defective. He sank every moment in her estimation by the strong comparison. "I have had such a nice time," said Carrie, when it was all over and they were coming out. "Yes, indeed," added Druitt, who was not in the least aware that a battle had been fought and his defenses weakened. He was like the Emperor of China, who sat glorying in himself, unaware that his fairest provinces were being wrested from him. "Well, you have saved me a dreary evening," returned Hurstwood. "Good night." He took Carrie's little hand, and a current of feeling swept from one to the other. "I'm so tired," said Carrie, leaning back in the car when Druitt began to talk. "Well, you rest a little while I smoke," he said, rising, and then he foolishly went to the forward platform of the car and left the game as it stood. Chapter 12. Of the Lamps of the Mansions, the Ambassador's Plea. Mrs. Hurstwood was not aware of any of her husband's moral defections, though she might readily have suspected his tendencies, which she well understood. She was a woman upon whose action under provocation you could never count. Hurstwood, for one, had not the slightest idea of what she would do under certain circumstances. He had never seen her thoroughly aroused. In fact, she was not a woman who would fly into a passion. She had too little faith in mankind not to know that they were erring. She was too calculating to jeopardize any advantage she might gain in the way of information by fruitless clamor. Her wrath would never wreak itself in one fell blow. She would wait and brood, studying the details and adding to them until her power might be commensurate with her desire for revenge. At the same time, she would not delay to inflict any injury, big or little, which would wound the object of her revenge and still leave him uncertain as to the source of the evil. She was a cold, self-centered woman, with many a thought of her own which never found expression, not even by so much as the glint of an eye. Hurstwood felt some of this in her nature, though he did not actually perceive it. He dwelt with her in peace and some satisfaction. He did not fear her in the least, there was no cause for it. She still took a faint pride in him, which was augmented by her desire to have her social integrity maintained. She was secretly somewhat pleased by the fact that much of her husband's property was in her name, a precaution which Hurstwood had taken when his home interests were somewhat more alluring than at present. His wife had not the slightest reason to feel that anything would ever go amiss with their household, and yet the shadows which run before gave her a thought of the good of it now and then. She was in a position to become refractory with considerable advantage, and Hurstwood conducted himself circumspectly because he felt that he could not be sure of anything once she became dissatisfied. It so happened that on the night when Hurstwood, Carrie, and Druitt were in the box at McVicker's, George Jr. was in the sixth row of the parquet with the daughter of H.B. Carmichael, the third partner of a wholesale dry goods house of that city. Hurstwood did not see his son, for he sat, as was his wont, as far back as possible, leaving himself just partially visible, when he bent forward, to those within the first 6 rows in question. It was his wont to sit this way in every theater to make his personality as inconspicuous as possible where it would be no advantage to him to have it otherwise. He never moved but what, if there was any danger of his conduct being misconstrued or ill-reported, he looked carefully about him and counted the cost of every inch of conspicuity. The next morning at breakfast his son said, "I saw you, Governor, last night." "Were you at McVicker's?" said Hurstwood, with the best grace in the world. "Yes," said young George. "Who with?" "Miss Carmichael." Mrs. Hurstwood directed an inquiring glance at her husband, but could not judge from his appearance whether it was any more than a casual look into the theater which was referred to. "How was the play?" she inquired. "Very good," returned Hurstwood, "only it's the same old thing, Rip Van Winkle." "Whom did you go with?" queried his wife, with assumed indifference. "Charlie Druitt and his wife. They are friends of Moy's, visiting here." Owing to the peculiar nature of his position, such a disclosure as this would ordinarily create no difficulty. His wife took it for granted that his situation called for certain social movements in which she might not be included. But of late he had pleaded office duty on several occasions when his wife asked for his company to any evening entertainment. He had done so in regard to the very evening in question only the morning before. "I thought you were going to be busy," she remarked, very carefully. "So I was," he exclaimed. "I couldn't help the interruption, but I made up for it afterward by working until 2. This settled the discussion for the time being, but there was a residue of opinion which was not satisfactory. There was no time at which the claims of his wife could have been more unsatisfactorily pushed. For years he had been steadily modifying his matrimonial devotion, and found her company dull. Now that a new light shone upon the horizon, this older luminary paled in the west. He was satisfied to turn his face away entirely, and any call to look back was irksome. She, on the contrary, was not at all inclined to accept anything less than a complete fulfillment of the letter of their relationship, though the spirit might be wanting. "We are coming downtown this afternoon," she remarked, a few days later. "I want you to come over to Kinsley's and meet Mr. Phillips and his wife. They're stopping at the Tremont, and we're going to show them around a little." After the occurrence of Wednesday, he could not refuse, though the Phillips were about as uninteresting as vanity and ignorance could make them. He agreed, but it was with short grace. He was angry when he left the house. "I'll put a stop to this," he thought. "I'm not going to be bothered fooling around with visitors when I have work to do." Not long after this Mrs. Hurstwood came with a similar proposition, only it was to a matinee this time. "My dear," he returned, "I haven't time. I'm too busy." "You find time to go with other people, though," she replied, with considerable irritation. "Nothing of the kind," he answered. "I can't avoid business relations, and that's all there is to it." "Well, never mind," she exclaimed. Her lips tightened. The feeling of mutual antagonism was increased. On the other hand, his interest in Druitt's little shop girl grew in an almost evenly balanced proportion. That young lady, under the stress of her situation and the tutelage of her new friend, changed effectively. She had the aptitude of the struggler who seeks emancipation. The glow of a more showy life was not lost upon her. She did not grow in knowledge so much as she awakened in the matter of desire. Mrs. Hale's extended harangues upon the subjects of wealth and position taught her to distinguish between degrees of wealth. Mrs. Hale loved to drive in the afternoon in the sun when it was fine, and to satisfy her soul with a sight of those mansions and lawns which she could not afford. On the north side had been erected a number of elegant mansions along what is now known as the North Shore Drive. The present lake wall of stone and granitoid was not then in place, but the road had been well laid out. The intermediate spaces of lawn were lovely to look upon, and the houses were thoroughly new and imposing. When the winter season had passed and the first fine days of the early spring appeared, Mrs. Hale secured a buggy for an afternoon and invited Carrie. They rode first through Lincoln Park and on far out towards Evanston, turning back at 4 and arriving at the north end of the Shore Drive at about 5 o'clock. At this time of year the days are still comparatively short, and the shadows of the evening were beginning to settle down upon the great city. Lamps were beginning to burn with that mellow radiance which seems almost watery and translucent to the eye. There was a softness in the air which speaks with an infinite delicacy of feeling to the flesh as well as to the soul. Carrie felt that it was a lovely day. She was ripened by it in spirit for many suggestions. As they drove along the smooth pavement an occasional carriage passed. She saw one stop and the footman dismount, opening the door for a gentleman who seemed to be leisurely returning from some afternoon pleasure. Across the broad lawns, now first freshening into green, she saw lamps faintly glowing upon rich interiors. Now it was but a chair, now a table, now an ornate corner, which met her eye, but it appealed to her as almost nothing else could. Such childish fancies as she had had of fairy palaces and kingly quarters now came back. She imagined that across these richly carved entrance-ways, where the globed and crystalled lamps shone upon paneled doors set with stained and designed panes of glass, was neither care nor unsatisfied desire. She was perfectly certain that here was happiness. If she could but stroll up yon broad walk, cross that rich entrance-way, which to her was of the beauty of a jewel, and sweep in grace and luxury to possession and command. Ah! How quickly would sadness flee, how, in an instant, would the heartache end. She gazed and gazed, wondering, delighting, longing, and all the while the siren voice of the unrestful was whispering in her ear. "If we could have such a home as that," said Mrs. Hale sadly, "how delightful it would be." "And yet they do say," said Carrie, "that no one is ever happy." She had heard so much of the canting philosophy of the grapeless fox. "I notice," said Mrs. Hale, "that they all try mighty hard, though, to take their misery in a mansion." When she came to her own rooms, Carrie saw their comparative insignificance. She was not so dull but that she could perceive they were but 3 small rooms in a moderately well-furnished boarding house. She was not contrasting it now with what she had had, but what she had so recently seen. The glow of the palatial doors was still in her eye, the roll of cushioned carriages still in her ears. What, after all, was Druitt? What was she? At her window, she thought it over, rocking to and fro, and gazing out across the lamplit park toward the lamplit houses on Warren and Ashland Avenues. She was too wrought up to care to go down to eat, too pensive to do aught but rock and sing. Some old tunes crept to her lips, and, as she sang them, her heart sank. She longed and longed and longed. It was now for the old cottage room in Columbia City, now the mansion upon the shore drive, now the fine dress of some lady, now the elegance of some scene. She was sad beyond measure, and yet uncertain, wishing, fancying. Finally, it seemed as if all her state was one of loneliness and forsakenness, and she could scarce refrain from trembling at the lip. She hummed and hummed as the moments went by, sitting in the shadow by the window, and was therein as happy, though she did not perceive it, as she ever would be. While Carrie was still in this frame of mind, the house servant brought up the intelligence that Mr. Hurstwood was in the parlor asking to see Mr. and Mrs. Druitt. "I guess he doesn't know that Charlie is out of town," thought Carrie. She had seen comparatively little of the manager during the winter, but had been kept constantly in mind of him by one thing and another, principally by the strong impression he had made. She was quite disturbed for the moment as to her appearance, but soon satisfied herself by the aid of the mirror, and went below. Hurstwood was in his best form, as usual. He hadn't heard that Druitt was out of town. He was but slightly affected by the intelligence, and devoted himself to the more general topics which would interest Carrie. It was surprising the ease with which he conducted a conversation. He was like every man who has had the advantage of practice and knows he has sympathy. He knew that Carrie listened to him pleasurably, and, without the least effort, he fell into a train of observation which absorbed her fancy. He drew up his chair and modulated his voice to such a degree that what he said seemed wholly confidential. He confined himself almost exclusively to his observation of men and pleasures. He had been here and there, he had seen this and that. Somehow he made Carrie wish to see similar things, and all the while kept her aware of himself. She could not shut out the consciousness of his individuality and presence for a moment. He would raise his eyes slowly in smiling emphasis of something, and she was fixed by their magnetism. He would draw out, with the easiest grace, her approval. Once he touched her hand for emphasis and she only smiled. He seemed to radiate an atmosphere which suffused her being. He was never dull for a minute, and seemed to make her clever. At least, she brightened under his influence until all her best side was exhibited. She felt that she was more clever with him than with others. At least, he seemed to find so much in her to applaud. There was not the slightest touch of patronage. Druitt was full of it. There had been something so personal, so subtle, in each meeting between them, both when Druitt was present and when he was absent, that Carrie could not speak of it without feeling a sense of difficulty. She was no talker. She could never arrange her thoughts in fluent order. It was always a matter of feeling with her, strong and deep. Each time there had been no sentence of importance which she could relate, and as for the glances and sensations, what woman would reveal them? Such things had never been between her and Druitt. As a matter of fact, they could never be. She had been dominated by distress and the enthusiastic forces of relief which Druitt represented at an opportune moment when she yielded to him. Now she was persuaded by secret current feelings which Druitt had never understood. Hurstwood's glance was as effective as the spoken words of a lover, and more. They called for no immediate decision, and could not be answered. People in general attach too much importance to words. They are under the illusion that talking effects great results. As a matter of fact, words are, as a rule, the shallowest portion of all the argument. They but dimly represent the great surging feelings and desires which lie behind. When the distraction of the tongue is removed, the heart listens. In this conversation she heard, instead of his words, the voices of the things which he represented. How suave was the counsel of his appearance! How feelingly did his superior state speak for itself! The growing desire he felt for her lay upon her spirit as a gentle hand. She did not need to tremble at all, because it was invisible. She did not need to worry over what other people would say, what she herself would say, because it had no tangibility. She was being pleaded with, persuaded, led into denying old rights and assuming new ones, and yet there were no words to prove it. Such conversation as was indulged in held the same relationship to the actual mental enactments of the twain that the low music of the orchestra does to the dramatic incident which it is used to cover. "Have you ever seen the houses along the lake shore on the north side?" asked Hurstwood. "Why, I was just over there this afternoon, Mrs. Hale, and aren't they beautiful?" "They're very fine," he answered. "Oh, me," said Carrie, pensively. "I wish I could live in such a place." "You're not happy," said Hurstwood, slowly, after a slight pause. He had raised his eyes solemnly and was looking into her own. He assumed that he had struck a deep chord. Now was a slight chance to say a word in his own behalf. He leaned over quietly and continued his steady gaze. He felt the critical character of the period. She endeavored to stir, but it was useless. The whole strength of a man's nature was working. He had good cause to urge him on. He looked, and the longer the situation lasted the more difficult it became. The little shop girl was getting into deep water. She was letting her few supports float away from her. "Oh," she said at last, "you mustn't look at me like that." "I can't help it," he answered. She relaxed a little and let the situation endure, giving him strength. "You are not satisfied with life, are you?" "No," she answered, weakly. He saw he was the master of the situation, he felt it. He reached over and touched her hand. "You mustn't," she exclaimed, jumping up. "I didn't intend to," he answered, easily. She did not run away, as she might have done. She did not terminate the interview, but he drifted off into a pleasant field of thought with the readiest grace. Not long after he rose to go, and she felt that he was in power. "You mustn't feel bad," he said, kindly, "things will straighten out in the course of time." She made no answer, because she could think of nothing to say. "We are good friends, aren't we?" he said, extending his hand. "Yes," she answered. "Not a word, then, until I see you again." He retained a hold on her hand. "I can't promise," she said, doubtfully. "You must be more generous than that," he said, in such a simple way that she was touched. "Let's not talk about it any more," she returned. "All right," he said, brightening. He went down the steps and into his cab. Carrie closed the door and ascended into her room. She undid her broad lace collar before the mirror and unfastened her pretty alligator belt which she had recently bought. "I'm getting terrible," she said, honestly affected by a feeling of trouble and shame. "I don't seem to do anything right." She unloosed her hair after a time, and let it hang in loose brown waves. Her mind was going over the events of the evening. "I don't know," she murmured at last, "what I can do." "Well," said Hurstwood as he rode away, "she likes me all right, that I know." The aroused manager whistled merrily for a good 4 miles to his office, an old melody that he had not recalled for 15 years, Chapter 13. His credentials accepted, a babel of tongues. It was not quite 2 days after the scene between Carrie and Hurstwood in the Ogden Place parlor before he again put in his appearance. He had been thinking almost uninterruptedly of her. Her leniency had, in a way, inflamed his regard. He felt that he must succeed with her, and that speedily. The reason for his interest, not to say fascination, was deeper than mere desire. It was a flowering out of feelings which had been withering in dry and almost barren soil for many years. It is probable that Carrie represented a better order of woman than had ever attracted him before. He had had no love affair since that which culminated in his marriage, and since then time and the world had taught him how raw and erroneous was his original judgment. Whenever he thought of it, he told himself that, if he had it to do over again, he would never marry such a woman. At the same time, his experience with women in general had lessened his respect for the sex. He maintained a cynical attitude, well grounded on numerous experiences. Such women as he had known were of nearly one type: selfish, ignorant, flashy. The wives of his friends were not inspiring to look upon. His own wife had developed a cold, commonplace nature which to him was anything but pleasing. What he knew of that underworld where grovel the beast men of society, and he knew a great deal, had hardened his nature. He looked upon most women with suspicion, a single eye to the utility of beauty and dress. He followed them with a keen, suggestive glance. At the same time, he was not so dull but that a good woman commanded his respect. Personally, he did not attempt to analyze the marvel of a saintly woman. He would take off his hat, and would silence the light-tongued and the vicious in her presence, much as the Irish keeper of a Bowery hall will humble himself before a sister of mercy, and pay toll to charity with a willing and reverent hand. But he would not think much upon the question of why he did so. A man in his situation who comes, after a long round of worthless or hardening experiences, upon a young, unsophisticated, innocent soul, is apt either to hold aloof, out of a sense of his own remoteness, or to draw near and become fascinated and elated by his discovery. It is only by a roundabout process that such men ever do draw near such a girl. They have no method, no understanding of how to ingratiate themselves in youthful favor, save when they find virtue in the toils. If, unfortunately, the fly has got caught in the net, the spider can come forth and talk business upon its own terms. So when maidenhood has wandered into the moil of the city, when it is brought within the circle of the rounder and the roué, even though it be at the outermost rim, they can come forth and use their alluring arts. Hurstwood had gone, at Druitt's invitation, to meet a new baggage of fine clothes and pretty features. He entered, expecting to indulge in an evening of lightsome frolic, and then lose track of the newcomer forever. Instead he found a woman whose youth and beauty attracted him. In the mild light of Carrie's eye was nothing of the calculation of the mistress. In the diffident manner was nothing of the art of the courtesan. He saw at once that a mistake had been made, that some difficult conditions had pushed this troubled creature into his presence, and his interest was enlisted. Here sympathy sprang to the rescue, but it was not unmixed with selfishness. He wanted to win Carrie because he thought her fate mingled with his was better than if it were united with Druitt's. He envied the drummer his conquest as he had never envied any man in all the course of his experience. Carrie was certainly better than this man, as she was superior, mentally, to Druitt. She came fresh from the air of the village, the light of the country still in her eye. Here was neither guile nor rapacity. There were slight inherited traits of both in her, but they were rudimentary. She was too full of wonder and desire to be greedy. She still looked about her upon the great maze of the city without understanding. Hurstwood felt the bloom and the youth. He picked her as he would the fresh fruit of a tree. He felt as fresh in her presence as one who is taken out of the flash of summer to the first cool breath of spring. Carrie, left alone since the scene in question, and having no one with whom to counsel, had at first wandered from one strange mental conclusion to another, until at last, tired out, she gave it up. She owed something to Druitt, she thought. It did not seem more than yesterday that he had aided her when she was worried and distressed. She had the kindliest feelings for him in every way. She gave him credit for his good looks, his generous feelings, and even, in fact, failed to recollect his egotism when he was absent, but she could not feel any binding influence keeping her for him as against all others. In fact, such a thought had never had any grounding, even in Druitt's desires. The truth is, that this goodly drummer carried the doom of all enduring relationships in his own lightsome manner and unstable fancy. He went merrily on, assured that he was alluring all, that affection followed tenderly in his wake, that things would endure unchangingly for his pleasure. When he missed some old face, or found some door finally shut to him, it did not grieve him deeply. He was too young, too successful. He would remain thus young in spirit until he was dead. As for Hurstwood, he was alive with thoughts and feelings concerning Carrie. He had no definite plans regarding her, but he was determined to make her confess an affection for him. He thought he saw in her drooping eye, her unstable glance, her wavering manner, the symptoms of a budding passion. He wanted to stand near her and make her lay her hand in his. He wanted to find out what her next step would be, what the next sign of feeling for him would be. Such anxiety and enthusiasm had not affected him for years. He was a youth again in feeling, a cavalier in action. In his position, opportunity for taking his evenings out was excellent. He was a most faithful worker in general, and a man who commanded the confidence of his employers in so far as the distribution of his time was concerned. He could take such hours off as he chose, for it was well known that he fulfilled his managerial duties successfully, whatever time he might take. His grace, tact, and ornate appearance gave the place an air which was most essential, while at the same time his long experience made him a most excellent judge of its stock necessities. Bartenders and assistants might come and go, singly or in groups, but, so long as he was present, the host of old-time customers would barely notice the change. He gave the place the atmosphere to which they were used. Consequently, he arranged his hours very much to suit himself, taking now an afternoon, now an evening, but invariably returning between 11 and 12 to witness the last hour or two of the day's business and look after the closing details. "You see that things are safe and all the employees are out when you go home," George Comemoy had once remarked to him, and he never once, in all the period of his long service, neglected to do this. Neither of the owners had for years been in the resort after 5 in the afternoon, and yet their manager as faithfully fulfilled this request as if they had been there regularly to observe. On this Friday afternoon, scarcely 2 days after his previous visit, he made up his mind to see Carrie. He could not stay away longer. "Evans, he said, addressing the head barkeeper, "if anyone calls, I will be back between 4 and 5." He hurried to Madison Street and boarded a horse car, which carried him to Ogden Place in half an hour. Carrie had thought of going for a walk, and had put on a light gray woolen dress with a jaunty double-breasted jacket. She had out her hat and gloves, and was fastening a white lace tie about her throat when the housemaid brought up the information that Mr. Hurstwood wished to see her. She started slightly at the announcement, but told the girl to say that she would come down in a moment, and proceeded to hasten her dressing. Carrie could not have told herself at this moment whether she was glad or sorry that the impressive manager was awaiting her presence. She was slightly flurried and tingling in the cheeks, but it was more nervousness than either fear or favor. She did not try to conjecture what the drift of the conversation would be. She only felt that she must be careful, and that Hurstwood had an indefinable fascination for her. Then she gave her tie its last touch with her fingers and went below. The deep-feeling manager was himself a little strained in the nerves by the thorough consciousness of his mission. He felt that he must make a strong play on this occasion, but now that the hour was come, and he heard Carrie's feet upon the stair, his nerve failed him. He sank a little in determination, for he was not so sure, after all, what her opinion might be. When she entered the room, however, her appearance gave him courage. She looked simple and charming enough to strengthen the daring of any lover. Her apparent nervousness dispelled his own. "How are you?" he said, easily. "I could not resist the temptation to come out this afternoon, It was so pleasant. Yes, said Carrie, halting before him. I was just preparing to go for a walk myself. Oh, were you? He said. Supposing, then, you get your hat and we both go? They crossed the park and went west along Washington Boulevard, beautiful with its broad macadamized road, and large frame houses set back from the sidewalks. It was a street where many of the more prosperous residents of the West Side lived, and Hurstwood could not help feeling nervous over the publicity of it. They had gone but a few blocks when a livery stable sign in one of the side streets solved the difficulty for him. He would take her to drive along the new boulevard. The boulevard at that time was little more than a country road. The part he intended showing her was much farther out on this same west side, where there was scarcely a house. It connected Douglas Park with Washington or South Park, and was nothing more than a neatly made road, running due south for some 5 miles over an open, grassy prairie, and then due east over the same kind of prairie for the same distance. There was not a house to be encountered anywhere along the larger part of the route, and any conversation would be pleasantly free of interruption. At the stable he picked a gentle horse, and they were soon out of range of either public observation or hearing. Can you drive? He said, after a time. I never tried, said Carrie. He put the reins in her hand, and folded his arms. You see, there's nothing to it much, he said, smilingly. Not when you have a gentle horse, said Carrie. You can handle a horse as well as anyone, after a little practice, he added, encouragingly. He had been looking for some time for a break in the conversation when he could give it a serious turn. Once or twice he had held his peace, hoping that in silence her thoughts would take the color of his own, but she had lightly continued the subject. Presently, however, his silence controlled the situation. The drift of his thoughts began to tell. He gazed fixedly at nothing in particular, as if he were thinking of something which concerned her not at all. His thoughts, however, spoke for themselves. She was very much aware that a climax was pending. Do you know, he said, I have spent the happiest evenings in years since I have known you? Have you? She said, with assumed airiness, but still excited by the conviction which the tone of his voice carried. I was going to tell you the other evening, he added, but somehow the opportunity slipped away. Carrie was listening without attempting to reply. She could think of nothing worthwhile to say. Despite all the ideas concerning Wright which had troubled her vaguely since she had last seen him, she was now influenced again strongly in his favor. I came out here today, he went on, solemnly, to tell you just how I feel, to see if you wouldn't listen to me. Hurstwood was something of a romanticist after his kind. He was capable of strong feelings, often poetic ones, and under a stress of desire, such as the present, he waxed eloquent. That is, his feelings and his voice were colored with that seeming repression and pathos which is the essence of eloquence. You know, he said, putting his hand on her arm, and keeping a strange silence while he formulated words, that I love you? Carrie did not stir at the words. She was bound up completely in the man's atmosphere. He would have church-like silence in order to express his feelings, and she kept it. She did not move her eyes from the flat, open scene before her. Hurstwood waited for a few moments, and then repeated the words. You must not say that, she said, weakly. Her words were not convincing at all. They were the result of a feeble thought that something ought to be said. He paid no attention to them whatever. Carrie, he said, using her first name with sympathetic familiarity, I want you to love me. You don't know how much I need someone to waste a little affection on me. I am practically alone. There is nothing in my life that is pleasant or delightful. It's all work and worry with people who are nothing to me. As he said this, Hurstwood really imagined that his state was pitiful. He had the ability to get off at a distance and view himself objectively, of seeing what he wanted to see in the things which made up his existence. Now, as he spoke, his voice trembled with that peculiar vibration which is the result of tensity. It went ringing home to his companion's heart. Why, I should think, she said, turning upon him large eyes which were full of sympathy and feeling, that you would be very happy. You know so much of the world. That is it, he said, his voice dropping to a soft minor. I know too much of the world. It was an important thing to her to hear one so well positioned and powerful speaking in this manner. She could not help feeling the strangeness of her situation. How was it that, in so little a while, the narrow life of the country had fallen from her as a garment, and the city, with all its mystery, taken its place? Here was this greatest mystery, the man of money and affairs sitting beside her, appealing to her. Behold, he had ease and comfort, his strength was great, his position high, his clothing rich, and yet he was appealing to her. She could formulate no thought which would be just and right. She troubled herself no more upon the matter. She only basked in the warmth of his feeling, which was as a grateful blaze to one who is cold. Hurstwood glowed with his own intensity, and the heat of his passion was already melting the wax of his companion's scruples. You think, he said, I am happy, that I ought not to complain? If you were to meet all day with people who care absolutely nothing about you, if you went day after day to a place where there was nothing but show and indifference, if there was not one person in all those you knew to whom you could appeal for sympathy or talk to with pleasure, perhaps you would be unhappy too. He was striking a chord now which found sympathetic response in her own situation. She knew what it was to meet with people who were indifferent, to walk alone amid so many who cared absolutely nothing about you. Had not she? Was not she at this very moment quite alone? Who was there among all whom she knew to whom she could appeal for sympathy? Not one. She was left to herself to brood and wonder. I could be content, went on Hurstwood, if I had you to love me. If I had you to go to, you for a companion. As it is, I simply move about from place to place without any satisfaction. Time hangs heavily on my hands. Before you came I did nothing but idle and drift into anything that offered itself. Since you came, well, I've had you to think about. The old illusion that here was someone who needed her aid began to grow in Carrie's mind. She truly pitied this sad, lonely figure. To think that all his fine state should be so barren for want of her, that he needed to make such an appeal when she herself was lonely and without anchor. Surely, this was too bad. I am not very bad, he said, apologetically, as if he owed it to her to explain on this score. You think, probably, that I roam around, and get into all sorts of evil? I have been rather reckless, but I could easily come out of that. I need you to draw me back, if my life ever amounts to anything. Carrie looked at him with the tenderness which virtue ever feels in its hope of reclaiming vice. How could such a man need reclaiming? His errors, what were they, that she could correct? Small they must be, where all was so fine. At worst, they were gilded affairs, and with what leniency are gilded errors viewed. He put himself in such a lonely light that she was deeply moved. Is it that way? She mused. He slipped his arm about her waist, and she could not find the heart to draw away. With his free hand he seized upon her fingers. A breath of soft spring wind went bounding over the road, rolling some brown twigs of the previous autumn before it. The horse paced leisurely on, unguided. Tell me, he said, softly, that you love me. Her eyes fell consciously. Own to it, dear, he said, feelingly. You do, don't you? She made no answer, but he felt his victory. Tell me, he said, richly, drawing her so close that their lips were near together. He pressed her hand warmly, and then released it to touch her cheek. You do? He said, pressing his lips to her own. For answer, her lips replied. Now, he said, joyously, his fine eyes ablaze, you my own girl, aren't you? By way of further conclusion, her head lay softly upon his shoulder. Chapter 14. With eyes and not seeing, one influence weans. Carrie in her rooms that evening was in a fine glow, physically and mentally. She was deeply rejoicing in her affection for Hurstwood and his love, and looked forward with fine fancy to their next meeting Sunday night. They had agreed, without any feeling of enforced secrecy, that she should come downtown and meet him, though, after all, the need of it was the cause. Mrs. Hale, from her upper window, saw her come in. She thought to herself, she goes riding with another man when her husband is out of the city. He had better keep an eye on her. The truth is that Mrs. Hale was not the only one who had a thought on this score. The housemaid who had welcomed Hurstwood had her opinion also. She had no particular regard for Carrie, whom she took to be cold and disagreeable. At the same time, she had a fancy for the merry and easy-mannered Druitt, who threw her a pleasant remark now and then, and in other ways extended her the evidence of that regard which he had for all members of the sex. Hurstwood was more reserved and critical in his manner. He did not appeal to this bodized functionary in the same pleasant way. She wondered that he came so frequently, that Mrs. Druitt should go out with him this afternoon when Mr. Druitt was absent. She gave vent to her opinions in the kitchen where the cook was. As a result, a hum of gossip was set going which moved about the house in that secret manner common to gossip. Carrie, now that she had yielded sufficiently to Hurstwood to confess her affection, no longer troubled about her attitude towards him. Temporarily she gave little thought to Druitt, thinking only of the dignity and grace of her lover and of his consuming affection for her. On the first evening, she did little but go over the details of the afternoon. It was the first time her sympathies had ever been thoroughly aroused, and they threw a new light on her character. She had some power of initiative, latent before, which now began to exert itself. She looked more practically upon her state and began to see glimmerings of a way out. Hurstwood seemed a drag in the direction of honor. Her feelings were exceedingly creditable, in that they constructed out of these recent developments something which conquered freedom from dishonor. She had no idea what Hurstwood's next word would be. She only took his affection to be a fine thing, and appended better, more generous results accordingly. As yet, Hurstwood had only a thought of pleasure without responsibility. He did not feel that he was doing anything to complicate his life. His position was secure, his home life, if not satisfactory, was at least undisturbed, his personal liberty rather untrammeled. Carrie's love represented only so much added pleasure. He would enjoy this new gift over and above his ordinary allowance of pleasure. He would be happy with her and his own affairs would go on as they had, undisturbed. On Sunday evening Carrie dined with him at a place he had selected in East Adams Street, and thereafter they took a cab to what was then a pleasant evening resort out on Cottage Grove Avenue near 39th Street. In the process of his declaration he soon realized that Carrie took his love upon a higher basis than he had anticipated. She kept him at a distance in a rather earnest way, and submitted only to those tender tokens of affection which better become the inexperienced lover. Hurstwood saw that she was not to be possessed for the asking, and deferred pressing his suit too warmly. Since he feigned to believe in her married state he found that he had to carry out the part. His triumph, he saw, was still at a little distance. How far he could not guess. They were returning to Ogden Place in the cab, when he asked, "When will I see you again?" I don't know, she answered, wondering herself. "Why not come down to the fair, he suggested, "next Tuesday?" She shook her head. "Not so soon, she answered. "I'll tell you what I'll do, he added. I'll write you, care of this West Side Post Office. Could you call next Tuesday? Carrie assented. The cab stopped one door out of the way according to his call. "Good night, he whispered, as the cab rolled away. Unfortunately for the smooth progression of this affair, Druitt returned. Hurstwood was sitting in his imposing little office the next afternoon when he saw Druitt enter. "Why, hello, Charles, he called affably. "Back again?" "Yes, smiled Druitt, approaching and looking in at the door. Hurstwood arose. "Well, he said, looking the drummer over, rosy as ever, They began talking of the people they knew and things that had happened. "Been home yet?" finally asked Hurstwood. "No, I am going, though, said Druitt. "I remembered the little girl out there, said Hurstwood, and called once. Thought you wouldn't want her left quite alone." "Right you are, agreed Druitt. "How is she?" "Very well, said Hurstwood. "Rather anxious about you, though. You'd better go out now and cheer her up. I will, said Druitt, smilingly. Like to have you both come down and go to the show with me Wednesday, concluded Hurstwood at parting. Thanks, old man, said his friend. I'll see what the girl says and let you know. They separated in the most cordial manner. There's a nice fellow, Druitt thought to himself as he turned the corner towards Madison. Druitt is a good fellow, Hurstwood thought to himself as he went back into his office, but he's no man for Carrie. The thought of the latter turned his mind into a most pleasant vein, and he wondered how he would get ahead of the drummer. When Druitt entered Carrie's presence, he caught her in his arms as usual, but she responded to his kiss with a tremor of opposition. Well, he said, I had a great trip. Did you? How did you come out with that lacrosse man you were telling me about? Oh, fine, sold him a complete line. There was another fellow there, representing Bernstein, a regular hook-nosed sheeny, but he wasn't in it. I made him look like nothing at all. As he undid his collar and unfastened his studs, preparatory to washing his face and changing his clothes, he dilated upon his trip. Carrie could not help listening with amusement to his animated descriptions. I tell you, he said, I surprised the people at the office. I've sold more goods this last quarter than any other man of our house on the road. I sold $3,000 worth in lacrosse. He plunged his face in a basin of water, and puffed and blew as he rubbed his neck and ears with his hands, while Carrie gazed upon him with mingled thoughts of recollection and present judgment. He was still wiping his face, when he continued, I am going to strike for a raise in June. They can afford to pay it, as much business as I turn in. I'll get it too, don't you forget. I hope you do, said Carrie. And then if that little real estate deal I've got on goes through, we'll get married, he said with a great show of earnestness, the while he took his place before the mirror and began brushing his hair. I don't believe you ever intend to marry me, Charlie, Carrie said ruefully. The recent protestations of Hurstwood had given her courage to say this. Oh, yes I do, course I do. What put that into your head? He had stopped his trifling before the mirror now and crossed over to her. For the first time Carrie felt as if she must move away from him. But you've been saying that so long, she said, looking with her pretty face upturned into his. Well, and I mean it too, but it takes money to live as I want to. Now, when I get this increase, I can come pretty near fixing things all right, and I'll do it. Now, don't you worry, girlie. He patted her reassuringly upon the shoulder, but Carrie felt how really futile had been her hopes. She could clearly see that this easygoing soul intended no move in her behalf. He was simply letting things drift because he preferred the free round of his present state to any legal trammelings. In contrast, Hurstwood appeared strong and sincere. He had no easy manner of putting her off. He sympathized with her and showed her what her true value was. He needed her, while Druitt did not care. Oh, no, she said remorsefully, her tone reflecting some of her own success and more of her helplessness. You never will. Well, you wait a little while and see, he concluded. I'll marry you all right. Carrie looked at him and felt justified. She was looking for something which would calm her conscience, and here it was, a light, airy disregard of her claims upon his justice. He had faithfully promised to marry her, and this was the way he fulfilled his promise. Say, he said, after he had, as he thought, pleasantly disposed of the marriage question, I saw Hurstwood today, and he wants us to go to the theater with him. Carrie started at the name, but recovered quickly enough to avoid notice. When she asked, with assumed indifference. Wednesday. We'll go, 1 week? If you think so, she answered, her manner being so enforcedly reserved as to almost excite suspicion. Druitt noticed something, but he thought it was due to her feelings concerning their talk about marriage. He called once, he said. Yes, said Carrie, he was out here Sunday evening. Was he? Said Druitt. I thought from what he said that he had called a week or so ago. So he did, answered Carrie, who was wholly unaware of what conversation her lovers might have held. She was all at sea mentally, and fearful of some entanglement which might ensue, from which he would answer. "Oh, then he called twice?" said Druitt, the first shade of misunderstanding showing in his face. "Yes," said Carrie innocently, feeling now that Hurstwood must have mentioned but one call. Druitt imagined that he must have misunderstood his friend. He did not attach particular importance to the information, after all. "What did he have to say?" he queried, with slightly increased curiosity. "He said he came because he thought I might be lonely." "You hadn't been in there so long he wondered what had become of you." "George is a fine fellow," said Druitt, rather gratified by his conception of the manageress' interest. "Come on and we'll go out to dinner." When Hurstwood saw that Druitt was back, he wrote at once to Carrie, saying, "I told him I called on you, dearest, when he was away." "I did not say how often, but he probably thought once. Let me know of anything you may have said. Answer by special messenger when you get this, and, darling, I must see you. Let me know if you can meet me at Jackson and Throop Streets Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. I want to speak with you before we meet at the theater." Carrie received this Tuesday morning when she called at the West Side branch of the post office, and answered at once. "I said you called twice," she wrote. "He didn't seem to mind. I will try and be at Throop Street if nothing interferes. I seem to be getting very bad. It's wrong to act as I do, I know." Hurstwood, when he met her as agreed, reassured her on this score. "You mustn't worry, sweetheart," he said. "Just as soon as he goes on the road again we will arrange something. We'll fix it so that you won't have to deceive anyone." Carrie imagined that he would marry her at once, though he had not directly said so, and her spirits rose. She proposed to make the best of the situation until Druitt left again. "Don't show any more interest in me than you ever have," Hurstwood counseled concerning the evening at the theater. "You mustn't look at me steadily then," she answered, mindful of the power of his eyes. "I won't," he said, squeezing her hand at parting and giving the glance she had just cautioned against. "There," she said playfully, pointing a finger at him. "The show hasn't begun yet," he returned. He watched her walk from him with tender solicitation. Such youth and prettiness reacted upon him more subtly than wine. At the theater things passed as they had in Hurstwood's favor. If he had been pleasing to Carrie before, how much more so was he now? His grace was more permeating because it found a readier medium. Carrie watched his every movement with pleasure. She almost forgot poor Druitt, who babbled on as if he were the host. Hurstwood was too clever to give the slightest indication of a change. He paid, if anything, more attention to his old friend than usual, and yet in no way held him up to that subtle ridicule which a lover in favor may so secretly practice before the mistress of his heart. If anything, he felt the injustice of the game as it stood, and was not cheap enough to add to it the slightest mental taunt. Only the play produced an ironical situation, and this was due to Druitt alone. The scene was one in the Covenant, in which the wife listened to the seductive voice of a lover in the absence of her husband. "Served him right," said Druitt afterward, even in view of her keen expiation of her error. "I haven't any pity for a man who would be such a chump as that." "Well, you never can tell," returned Hurstwood gently. "He probably thought he was right." "Well, a man ought to be more attentive than that to his wife if he wants to keep her." They had come out of the lobby and made their way through the showy crush about the entranceway. "Say, Mr. said a voice at Hurstwood's side, "would you mind giving me the price of a bed?" Hurstwood was interestedly remarking to Carrie. "Honest to God, mister, I am without a place to sleep." The plea was that of a gaunt-faced man of about 30, who looked the picture of privation and wretchedness. Druitt was the first to see. He handed over a dime with an upwelling feeling of pity in his heart. Hurstwood scarcely noticed the incident. Carrie quickly forgot. Chapter 15. The IRK of the old ties, the magic of youth. The complete ignoring by Hurstwood of his own home came with the growth of his affection for Carrie. His actions, in all that related to his family, were of the most perfunctory kind. He sat at breakfast with his wife and children, absorbed in his own fancies, which reached far without the realm of their interests. He read his paper, which was heightened in interest by the shallowness of the themes discussed by his son and daughter. Between himself and his wife ran a river of indifference. Now that Carrie had come, he was in a fair way to be blissful again. There was delight in going downtown evenings. When he walked forth in the short days, the street lamps had a merry twinkle. He began to experience the almost forgotten feeling which hastens the lover's feet. When he looked at his fine clothes, he saw them with her eyes, and her eyes were young. When in the flush of such feelings he heard his wife's voice, when the insistent demands of matrimony recalled him from dreams to a stale practice, how it grated. He then knew that this was a chain which bound his feet. "George," said Mrs. Hurstwood, in that tone of voice which had long since come to be associated in his mind with demands, "we want you to get us a season ticket to the races." "Do you want to go to all of them?" he said with a rising inflection. "Yes," she answered. The races in question were soon to open at Washington Park, on the south side, and were considered quite society affairs among those who did not affect religious rectitude and conservatism. Mrs. Hurstwood had never asked for a whole season ticket before, but this year certain considerations decided her to get a box. For one thing, one of her neighbors, a certain Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, who were possessors of money, made out of the coal business, had done so. In the next place, her favorite physician, Dr. Beale, a gentleman inclined to horses and betting, had talked with her concerning his intention to enter a 2-year-old in the Derby. In the third place, she wished to exhibit Jessica, who was gaining in maturity and beauty, and whom she hoped to marry to a man of means. Her own desire to be about in such things and parade among her acquaintances and the common throng was as much an incentive as anything. Hurstwood thought over the proposition a few moments without answering. They were in the sitting room on the second floor, waiting for supper. It was the evening of his engagement with Carrie and drew it to see the covenant, which had brought him home to make some alterations in his dress. "You're sure separate tickets wouldn't do as well?" he asked, hesitating to say anything more rugged. "No," she replied impatiently. "Well," he said, taking offense at her manner, "you needn't get mad about it. I'm just asking you." "I'm not mad," she snapped. "I'm merely asking you for a season ticket. And I'm telling you," be returned, fixing a clear, steady eye on her, "that it's no easy thing to get. I'm not sure whether the manager will give it to me." He had been thinking all the time of his pull with the racetrack magnates. "We can buy it then," she exclaimed sharply. "You talk easy," he said. "A season family ticket costs $150. "I'll not argue with you," she replied with determination. "I want the ticket and that's all there is to it." She had risen, and now walked angrily out of the room. "Well, you get it then," he said grimly, though in a modified tone of voice. As usual, the table was one short that evening. The next morning he had cooled down considerably, and later the ticket was duly secured, though it did not heal matters. He did not mind giving his family a fair share of all that he earned, but he did not like to be forced to provide against his will. "Did you know, Mother," said Jessica another day, "the Spencers are getting ready to go away?" "No. Where, I wonder?" "Europe," said Jessica. "I met Georgine yesterday and she told me. She just put on more airs about it." "Did she say when?" "Monday, I think. They'll get a notice in the papers again, they always do." "Never mind," said Mrs. Hurstwood consolingly, "we'll go one of these days." Hurstwood moved his eyes over the paper slowly, but said nothing. "We sail for Liverpool from New York," Jessica exclaimed, mocking her acquaintance. "Expect to spend most of the summer in France, vain thing. As if it was anything to go to Europe." "It must be if you envy her so much," put in Hurstwood. It grated upon him to see the feeling his daughter displayed. "Don't worry over them, my dear," said Mrs. Hurstwood. "Did George get off?" asked Jessica of her mother another day, thus revealing something that Hurstwood had heard nothing about. "Where has he gone?" he asked, looking up. He had never before been kept in ignorance concerning departures. "He was going to Wheaton," said Jessica, not noticing the slight put upon her father. "What's out there?" he asked, secretly irritated and chagrined to think that he should be made to pump for information in this manner. "A tennis match," said Jessica. "He didn't say anything to me," Hurstwood concluded, finding it difficult to refrain from a bitter tone. "I guess he must have forgotten," exclaimed his wife blandly. In the past he had always commanded a certain amount of respect, which was a compound of appreciation and awe. The familiarity which in part still existed between himself and his daughter he had courted. As it was, it did not go beyond the light assumption of words. The tone was always modest. Whatever had been, however, had lacked affection, and now he saw that he was losing track of their doings. His knowledge was no longer intimate. He sometimes saw them at table, and sometimes did not. He heard of their doings occasionally, more often not. Some days he found that he was all at sea as to what they were talking about, things they had arranged to do or that they had done in his absence. More affecting was the feeling that there were little things going on of which he no longer heard. Jessica was beginning to feel that her affairs were her own. George Jr. flourished about as if he were a man entirely and must needs have private matters. All this Hurstwood could see, and it left a trace of feeling, for he was used to being considered in his official position, at least, and felt that his importance should not begin to wane here. To darken it all, he saw the same indifference and independence growing in his wife, while he looked on and paid the bills. He consoled himself with the thought, however, that, after all, he was not without affection. Things might go as they would at his house, but he had Carrie outside of it. With his mind's eye he looked into her comfortable room in Ogden Place, where he had spent several such delightful evenings, and thought how charming it would be when Druitt was disposed of entirely and she was waiting evenings in cozy little quarters for him. That no cause would come up whereby Druitt would be led to inform Carrie concerning his married state, he felt hopeful. Things were going so smoothly that he believed they would not change. Shortly now he would persuade Carrie and all would be satisfactory. The day after their theater visit he began writing her regularly a letter every morning, and begging her to do as much for him. He was not literary by any means, but experience of the world and his growing affection gave him somewhat of a style. This he exercised at his office desk with perfect deliberation. He purchased a box of delicately colored and scented writing paper in monogram, which he kept locked in one of the drawers. His friends now wondered at the cleric and very official-looking nature of his position. The 5 bartenders viewed with respect the duties which could call a man to do so much desk work and penmanship. Hurstwood surprised himself with his fluency. By the natural law which governs all effort, what he wrote reacted upon him. He began to feel those subtleties which he could find words to express. With every expression came increased conception. Those inmost breathings which there found words took bold upon him. He thought Carrie worthy of all the affection he could there express. Carrie was indeed worth loving if ever youth and grace are to command that token of acknowledgment from life in their bloom. Experience had not yet taken away that freshness of the spirit which is the charm of the body. Her soft eyes contained in their liquid luster no suggestion of the knowledge of disappointment. She had been troubled in a way by doubt and longing, but these had made no deeper impression than could be traced in a certain open wistfulness of glance and speech. The mouth had the expression at times, in talking and in repose, of one who might be upon the verge of tears. It was not that grief was thus ever present. The pronunciation of certain syllables gave to her lips this peculiarity of formation, a formation as suggestive and moving as pathos itself. There was nothing bold in her manner. Life had not taught her domination, superciliousness of grace, which is the lordly power of some women. Her longing for consideration was not sufficiently powerful to move her to demand it. Even now she lacked self-assurance, but there was that in what she had already experienced which left her a little less than timid. She wanted pleasure, she wanted position, and yet she was confused as to what these things might be. Every hour the kaleidoscope of human affairs threw a new luster upon something, and therewith it became for her the desired the all. Another shift of the box, and some other had become the beautiful, the perfect. On her spiritual side, also, she was rich in feeling, as such a nature well might be. Sorrow in her was aroused by many a spectacle and uncritical upwelling of grief for the weak and the helpless. She was constantly pained by the sight of the white-faced, ragged men who slopped desperately by her in a sort of wretched mental stupor. The poorly clad girls who went blowing by her window evenings, hurrying home from some of the shops of the West Side, she pitied from the depths of her heart. She would stand and bite her lips as they passed, shaking her little head and wondering. They had so little, she thought. It was so sad to be rad and poor. The hang of faded clothes pained her eyes. And they have to work so hard, was her only comment. On the street sometimes she would see men working, Irishmen with picks, coal heavers with great loads to shovel, Americans busy about some work which was a mere matter of strength, and they touched her fancy. Toil, now that she was free of it, seemed even a more desolate thing than when she was part of it. She saw it through a mist of fancy, a pale, somber half-light, which was the essence of poetic feeling. Her old father, in his flower-dusted miller's suit, sometimes returned to her in memory, revived by a face in a window. A shoemaker pegging at his last, a blastman seen through a narrow window in some basement where iron was being melted, a bench worker seen high aloft in some window, his coat off, his sleeves rolled up. These took her back in fancy to the details of the mill. She felt, though she seldom expressed them, sad thoughts upon this score. Her sympathies were ever with that underworld of toil from which she had so recently sprung, and which she best understood. Though Hurstwood did not know it, he was dealing with one whose feelings were as tender and as delicate as this. He did not know, but it was this in her, after all, which attracted him. He never attempted to analyze the nature of his affection. It was sufficient that there was tenderness in her eye, weakness in her manner, good nature and hope in her thoughts. He drew near this lily, which had sucked its waxen beauty and perfume from below a depth of waters which he had never penetrated, and out of ooze and mold which he could not understand. He drew near because it was waxen and fresh. It lightened his feelings for him. It made the morning worthwhile. In a material way, she was considerably improved. Her awkwardness had all but passed, leaving, if anything, a quaint residue which was as pleasing as perfect grace. Her little shoes now fitted her smartly and had high heels. She had learned much about laces and those little neck pieces which add so much to a woman's appearance. Her form had filled out until it was admirably plump and well-rounded. Hurstwood wrote her one morning, asking her to meet him in Jefferson Park, Monroe Street. He did not consider it policy to call any more, even when Druitt was at home. The next afternoon he was in the pretty little park by one, and had found a rustic bench beneath the green leaves of a lilac bush which bordered one of the paths. It was at that season of the year when the fullness of spring had not yet worn quite away. At a little pond nearby some cleanly dressed children were sailing white canvas boats. In the shade of a green pagoda a bee-buttoned officer of the law was resting, his arms folded, his club at rest in his belt. An old gardener was upon the lawn, with a pair of pruning shears, looking after some bushes. High overhead was the clear blue sky of the new summer, and in the thickness of the shiny green leaves of the trees hopped and twittered the busy sparrows. Hurstwood had come out of his own home that morning feeling much of the same old annoyance. At his store he had idled, there being no need to write. He had come away to this place with the lightness of heart which characterizes those who put weariness behind. Now, in the shade of this cool, green bush, he looked about him with the fancy of the lover. He heard the carts go lumbering by upon the neighboring streets, but they were far off, and only buzzed upon his ear. The hum of the surrounding city was faint, the clang of an occasional bell was as music. He looked and dreamed a new dream of pleasure which concerned his present fixed condition not at all. He got back in fancy to the old Hurstwood, who was neither married nor fixed in a solid position for life. He remembered the light spirit in which he once looked after the girls, how he had danced, escorted them home, hung over their gates. He almost wished he was back there again. Here in this pleasant scene he felt as if he were wholly free. At 2 Carrie came tripping along the walk toward him, rosy and clean. She had just recently donned a sailor hat for the season with a hand of pretty white dotted blue silk. Her skirt was of a rich blue material, and her shirt waist matched it, with a thin stripe of blue upon a snow-white ground, stripes that were as fine as hairs. Her brown shoes peeped occasionally from beneath her skirt. She carried her gloves in her hand. Hurstwood looked up at her with delight. "You came, dearest," he said eagerly, standing to meet her and taking her hand. "Of course," she said, smiling. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I didn't know," he replied. He looked at her forehead, which was moist from her brisk walk. Then he took out one of his own soft, scented silk handkerchiefs and touched her face here and there. "Now," he said affectionately, "you're all right." They were happy in being near one another, in looking into each other's eyes. Finally, when the long flush of delight had subsided, he said, "When is Charlie going away again?" "I don't know," she answered. "He says he has some things to do for the house here now." Hurstwood grew serious, and he lapsed into quiet thought. He looked up after a time to say, "Come away and leave him." He turned his eyes to the boys with the boats, as if the request were of little importance. "Where would we go?" she asked in much the same manner, rolling her gloves, and looking into a neighboring tree. "Where do you want to go?" he inquired. There was something in the tone in which he said this which made her feel as if she must record her feelings against any local habitation. "We can't stay in Chicago," she replied. He had no thought that this was in her mind, that any removal would be suggested. "Why not?" he asked softly. "Oh, because," she said, "I wouldn't want to." He listened to this, with but dull perception of what it meant. It had no serious ring to it. The question was not up for immediate decision. "I would have to give up my position," he said. The tone he used made it seem as if the matter deserved only slight consideration. Carrie thought a little, the while enjoying the pretty scene. "I wouldn't like to live in Chicago and him here," she said, thinking of Druitt. "It's a big town, dearest," Hurstwood answered. "It would be as good as moving to another part of the country to move to the south side." He had fixed upon that region as an objective point. "Anyhow," said Carrie, "I shouldn't want to get married as long as he is here. I wouldn't want to run away." The suggestion of marriage struck Hurstwood forcibly. He saw clearly that this was her idea. He felt that it was not to be gotten over easily. Bigamy lightened the horizon of his shadowy thoughts for a moment. He wondered for the life of him how it would all come out. He could not see that he was making any progress save in her regard. When he looked at her now, he thought her beautiful. What a thing it was to have her love him, even if it be entangling. She increased in value in his eyes because of her objection. She was something to struggle for, and that was everything. How different from the women who yielded willingly. He swept the thought of them from his mind. "And you don't know when he'll go away?" asked Hurstwood, quietly. She shook her head. He sighed. "You're a determined little miss, aren't you?" he said, after a few moments, looking up into her eyes. She felt a wave of feeling sweep over her at this. It was pride at what seemed his admiration, affection for the man who could feel this concerning her. "No," she said coyly, "but what can I do?" Again he folded his hands and looked away over the lawn into the street. "I wish," he said pathetically, "you would come to me. I don't like to be away from you this way. What good is there in waiting? You're not any happier, are you?" "Happier?" she exclaimed softly, "you know better than that." "Here we are then," he went on in the same tone, "wasting our days. If you are not happy, do you think I am? I sit and write to you the biggest part of the time. I'll tell you what, Carrie," he exclaimed, throwing sudden force of expression into his voice and fixing her with his eyes, "I can't live without you, and that's all there is to it. Now," he concluded, showing the palm of one of his white hands in a sort of at an end, helpless expression, "what shall I do?" This shifting of the burden to her appealed to Carrie. The semblance of the load without the weight touched the woman's heart. "Can't you wait a little while yet?" she said tenderly. "I'll try and find out when he's going." "What good will it do?" he asked, holding the same strain of feeling. "Well, perhaps we can arrange to go somewhere." She really did not see anything clearer than before, but she was getting into that frame of mind where, out of sympathy, a woman yields. Hurstwood did not understand. He was wondering how she was to be persuaded, what appeal would move her to forsake Druitt. He began to wonder how far her affection for him would carry her. He was thinking of some question which would make her tell. Finally he hit upon one of those problematical propositions which often disguise our own desires while leading us to an understanding of the difficulties which others make for us, and so discover for us a way. It had not the slightest connection with anything intended on his part, and was spoken at random before he had given it a moment's serious thought. "Carrie," he said, looking into her face and assuming a serious look which he did not feel, "suppose I were to come to you next week, or this week for that matter tonight, say, and tell you I had to go away, that I couldn't stay another minute and wasn't coming back anymore, would you come with me?" His sweetheart viewed him with the most affectionate glance, her answer ready before the words were out of his mouth. "Yes," she said. "You wouldn't stop to argue or arrange?" "Not if you couldn't wait." He smiled when he saw that she took him seriously, and he thought what a chance it would afford for a possible junket of a week or two. He had a notion to tell her that he was joking and so brush away her sweet seriousness, but the effect of it was too delightful. He let it stand. "Suppose we didn't have time to get married here?" he added, an afterthought striking him. "If we got married as soon as we got to the other end of the journey it would be all right." "I meant that," he said. "Yes." The morning seemed peculiarly bright to him now. He wondered whatever could have put such a thought into his head. Impossible as it was, he could not help smiling at its cleverness. It showed how she loved him. There was no doubt in his mind now, and he would find a way to win her. "Well," he said, jokingly, "I'll come and get you one of these evenings," and then he laughed. "I wouldn't stay with you, though, if you didn't marry me," Carrie added reflectively. "I don't want you to," he said tenderly, taking her hand. She was extremely happy now that she understood. She loved him the more for thinking that he would rescue her so. As for him, the marriage clause did not dwell in his mind. He was thinking that with such affection there could be no bar to his eventual happiness. "Let's stroll about," he said gaily, rising and surveying all the lovely park. "All right," said Carrie. They passed the young Irishman, who looked after them with envious eyes. "'Tis a foine couple," he observed to himself. "They must be rich."